Now we shall take a look at the first settlement and exploration of Louisiana by looking at the Paleo-Amerindians, the Meso-Amerindians, Louisiana tribal inhabitants, later arrivals, then the mercantile push, the exploration of North America. Then we'll see the father and the fur trapper, and finish with the disastrous expedition. The Paleo-Amerindians, that is the Stone Age Amerindians, arrived in the area of Louisiana approximately 8,000 to 6,000 BC. As we know, most of the native inhabitants of the United States migrated over from Eurasia when the Alaska and Russia were connected by a land bridge, and then were isolated when the seas rose. Primarily, these people were hunters and gatherers. When they moved and migrated south into Louisiana, one of the main archaeological sites that we discovered that they had left was called Poverty Point, located near Epps in West Carroll Parish. There we discovered numerous artifacts, and we saw mounds and ridges that are still standing. Poverty Point was discovered primarily through what is called space archaeology. That is, you could not really see what Poverty Point was from the ground, but you could see it from the sky or from space. And in the process, they realized that these ridges and circles were actually man-made, and that watercourse that you see there was actually the Mississippi River at one time when it had flowed in that direction. And you could see that it was a very well-organized place of worship and burial. The Meso-Amerindians, so that is the Middle Amerindians, arrived around 6,500 to 2000 BC. They hunted smaller game as the larger animals disappeared, and their main artifacts are called middens, which are basically garbage dumps of shells, from the shells of sea creatures that they shelled and then eat. They had a more sophisticated religion and tribal culture than the folks at Poverty Point, and they would lay down the foundation for the tribal situation in Louisiana. The Louisiana tribal inhabitants are grouped according to their linguistic family. That's not so much a political designation as it is a linguistic designation. The Attakapas in far southwest Louisiana, the name means human flesh eater. Their main tribes were the Sunset, the Sunrise, and the Opelousas Indians. The Tunica, who inhabited northeast Louisiana and then moved down into the Florida parishes, had a highly developed economy based on the salt trade. They were semi-nomadic, and they left what was called the Tunica Treasure, a wealth of artifacts uncovered in the 1970s by archaeologists. One of the more famous tribes of Louisiana are, of course, the Natchez, who existed in East Louisiana. They were centered at a city called White Apple, and their chief was known as the Great Sun. The Muskegon tribe of Indians inhabited the Florida parishes. They consist of the Bayou-Gula-Homa tribes, the Quinnipiasa, the Acalapisa, and the Tangipahoa Indians. These Indians were granite miners. You also had the Chitimacha Indians. These are the folks that inhabited South Louisiana. They were the Washa, the Chawasha, and the Chitimacha Indians. They were highly cultured, but they were poorly unified. However, they were federally recognized in 1925, and that means they have a casino, and their tribal center is located in Charenton, near that casino. Most famous and lasting of all the tribes in Louisiana are the Caddo. The Caddo, which existed in northwest Louisiana and also in North Texas, southwestern Arkansas, southern Oklahoma, these Indians inhabited the Red River Valley. They were hunters and farmers, and their main tribal groups were the Hasinai, the Chaco, and the Natchitoches. Their chief was called the Great Cuddy, and their high priest was called the Zinsei. They were very accommodating to the Europeans, but they were strongly independent and well-organized Indians, extremely peaceful. There were also later Amerindian arrivals in Louisiana. You have the Choctaw also one of the most famous of Louisiana tribes. They were forced in by European expansion and became the largest tribal group in Louisiana itself. The Jenna Band of the Choctaw Indians has a cultural center located at Zwol, Louisiana. You also had the Biloxi, the Corsati, and the Lipan Indians who inhabited the Gulf Coast and Florida parishes. And let us not forget the Apaches. Yes, the famous Apaches, Geronimo's tribe, also inhabited Louisiana, especially in Allen Parish in the west. This was the situation that awaited the Europeans when they made their push into Louisiana. The mercantile push comes from the economic system called Mercantilism, created by a French nobleman by the name of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who was the chief financial minister to King Louis XIV. Mercantilism is an economic system where nations seek economic self-sufficiency through the acquisition of wealth in the form of gold and silver. And this economic system lasted from about 1400 to 1700. Now, for Spain and Portugal, this meant mining and native exploitation first, and then establishing trade second. For England and France, their mercantile system was based more on trade and manufacturing first. In other words, Spain and Portugal were going to take gold and silver out of the ground or exploit the native population to do it. England and France, on the other hand, would create systems that would produce goods that then other nations would pay gold and silver to produce. Now, they did not set out to do it that way at first. The circumstances dictated it because England and France landed in places where gold and silver was in very short supply, whereas the Spanish and the Portuguese landed upon mountains of gold and mountains of natives ready to be exploited. Here you see an early map of the Gulf of Mexico by the Spanish, and you can see that even without GPS, the Spanish were really good cartographers. Once these lands had been discovered, it was time to explore and claim them. And two of the men that essentially mapped, or began to first map the Mississippi River Valley, was a Jesuit priest, Father Père Jacques Marquette, and Louis Joliet, a professional explorer, and Coureur de Bois, which meant he was a fur trapper. Their expedition began in 1672. On the Great Lakes, they went overland to the Wisconsin River, which is a tributary of the Mississippi, and then they went downriver to the Mississippi River. They are the first Europeans to call the river by its name, which translated from the Indian means Father of Waters. The Indian pronunciation is Meso-Amerindians. They compiled a very detailed report, and they made it as far south as the Arkansas River, where the Indians there told them not to go any further because the Indians to the south were extremely unfriendly. And so they turned around and went back, but kept their notes. On the left is Jesuit Father Marquette receiving instructions from the Indians. On the right is the statue of Louis Joliet in the town that bears his name, Joliet, Illinois. Here again you see the map of the expedition and Marquette and Joliet in the canoe heading southward. Armed with the notes of Marquette and Joliet, René Robert Cavalier Sieur de la Salle, who was friends with Joliet, now organized his expedition, taking along his right-hand man, Henri de Tonty, known as the Iron Hand because of his strict discipline and great organization. They began their expedition in February of 1682, went all the way down the river to the mouth, and reached the mouth of the river in April, where they celebrated Mass near Southwest Pass. In the typical European arrogant style, they claimed the entire basin of the river for King Louis XIV of France and his wife, Queen Anne, hence the name Louisiana. Now, having completed the expedition, they returned 2 years later to establish a permanent colony. The problem is that they went in from the Gulf. The river had silted over at its mouth, and they could not find the point at which the water was discharging from the river into the Gulf, and so they missed the mouth of the river. They landed instead in Galveston Bay and tried to create a search party to find a Spanish settlement to get help. In the process, the crew mutinied and murdered Salle. The crew then was captured by the Spanish and returned to France, where they were, shall we say, met with justice. Here you see the map of the voyages of Marquette and Joliet and Salle. Tonty, who did not go on the second voyage, then gave his notes to a pair of brothers who were eager to follow up on Salle's voyage.